That's the basis of modern psychology that we're going to deal with. One of the things that the realization of other realms and other dimensions come to us in something that was relatively recent in human history, or Western history anyway, and that was in the 60s and 70s, and they began to realize that people were having near-death experiences. And it wasn't generally reported, because in the near-death experience, and you come back and you're talking, the doctors shrugged it off and say it was hallucinations, dreams. It wasn't important. So at relatively recent in history did we realize that it is important what these people were reporting. They were telling us something that applies to all of us. My acquaintance in little detail with near-death experience is based on a man that I got to know and became friends with, Dr. Greg Unterberger, who lives in Austin. And at the time, a few years ago, Dr. Greg had really investigated 4,000 cases of people who had near-death experiences. So he has quite an interesting take on it. First of all, what most people know about near-death experiences is that you're there and all of a sudden there's this being in light and it enfolds you and it reviews your life and so on. Dr. Unterberger realized that most of the near-death experiences in the 4,000 cases that he had investigated did not have an experience with the light. The majority of the near-death experiences do not encounter that spirit of life. So I thought that was very interesting. When it comes to this, there is literature in the Western world. One of the problems that we have, and I've said this many times, that as Christianity grew and you were suddenly dealing with thousands and then millions of people, they codified Christianity. They couldn't really sit down and study the works that Jesus gave us. A lot of the things that we think Jesus taught, you have to realize that they were given to a select group of people and that we're getting just a summary, that he, over a period of time, worked with those people in developing their consciousness. So when he told Peter, when Peter asked him, and I'm going to repeat this again, how do I have that mind that's in you? Jesus said, go in the closet, close the door, and pray and meditate. Well, when he was working with the apostles and the disciples, he was teaching them how to do that meditation. There are two forms of meditation. There's kind of a simple, to me, there's a simple way of meditation where you sit and you be quiet for 15 or 20 or 30 minutes. And then there's also something called the Kundalini Meditation. And that's a little more intense. You're dealing with an hour. You're dealing with about 15 minutes of preparation just to get into the Kundalini meditation. So there's one that's kind of superficial, which it seems superficial to me. If you're getting into meditation, it's definitely important. And then there's the Kundalini meditation, which is now you're serious. So we have some of the earliest writings in the Western world. It's not as simple, like I was saying, that when they began to deal with millions of people and they had to codify the religion and the teachings, they told you it developed, just be good, and when you die, you'll go to heaven. And it's not that simple. You could ask which heaven, because Scripture does mention there are heavens, plural. They're talking about dimensions and realms. So one of the first sources came from the Greeks in writing that we know of. There was a battle and a soldier leader was killed in the battle. So the Greeks were preparing the death thing. They had him on this pyre and they're going to light and cremate the body. So they're just ready to put the torches to the pyre, and he sits up. And he wasn't dead after all. Well, the Greeks had physicians. In fact, they were probably the leaders in medicine for the Western world. They could tell if somebody had a heartbeat or not, or if they had a pulse rate and things like that. So this man was declared dead by the Greek physicians. And here he is sitting up, and he related the experiences that he had when he was in that state. So that's the first writings that we have. The other source is from people that get out of their body at will. So out-of-body experiences is a way of moving into a dimension which is governed by your mind and your attitudes and your emotions. You have a degree of control if you will realize it. For example, if you're practicing getting out of your body, you can either sit or you can lay prone. Then it's important which direction your head is facing. My personal experience was that I reviewed yesterday for you that were here that I had a life review of all of my lives, down to the very beginning when my spirit soul manifested into the earth. I've never had to be hypnotized. I've never had even any curiosity because I can remember details and I can remember people. But when I came out of it and I began to study this work, I realized that that whole past life experience was because my head was pointing to the north. So the direction of your head will determine what experience, what kind of consciousness you will move in. There's a direction for health. One of the general no-nos in people that I've studied and worked with is you don't want your head to be pointing to the west. Facing to the west if you're sitting, or your head pointing to the west if you're laying prone. So you have a certain amount of control of that. What limits us in the awareness of higher states of mind is the fact that the soul is manifesting into a personality. And so the soul is actually narrowing its power to animate a very physical, very sensitive body. It operates through the mind, the mind operates through the brain. So from a few months maybe, or a couple of weeks or whatever, before a baby is born, it begins to receive impressions, and the brain is beginning to register it. Basically, the brain as it develops is a blank tablet. So those cells in the brain are going to begin receiving impulses and forming connections, and so the brain develops in that way. And it continues to develop, like I say, a few weeks, maybe a month before birth until you die. The brain is continuing to develop. But what is it developing? It is developing the input that we're getting from a three-dimensional material world. It's developing in a society. If it was the Middle Ages, it would be that society and all of the things that were related to that society, the limitations and the advantages. Or you're born in today's world and you have all the limitations and the potential, but it's all a material. So that's how the brain is developing. The interesting thing about that is in the first 5 or 6 years of your life, everything that brain develops has been inputted primarily by somebody else's information, be it parents or teachers. That's all somebody's information. Then from 5 or 6 on, you begin to develop your own ideas and your own thoughts, and your individuality begins to manifest more. And this is what the mind, the greater mind, has to operate through, is that brain. So when we have experiences on the other side, we come back and we have to describe them in terms that this three-dimensional world understands. So the earth really feels so realm. We become enmeshed in the physical, and when we die, we're suddenly very surprised at what we find. My experience was I had become very agnostic, even though I was raised really into a strong religious environment. And my term of service in the military really caused me to become an agnostic bordering on an atheist. So when I had this experience of near death, it was a shock. But it was more than just a shock. It was stunning. It changed my life because what I experienced on the other side completely changed the direction that I had been going in at the time. So there are many more realms and dimensions that we find in experience. Basically, we're going to work with 7 of them. I'll name them where there are scriptural references to them. When one of the references we have is that Philip asked Jesus about this, and Jesus says, "Where I'm going, you know, and the way you know." That's quoted in the Gospel of John, chapter 14. So what we've been taught was that if we're really good and obey the works of Jesus, we will go to a realm where Jesus will be in. And that is a consciousness. So even then, it's an indirect reference to there are dimensions in that other side. Okay, so when the passing from the realm, we gradually become aware of what that other side is. What do I mean by that? If you've been raised as very material, very oriented to the material, and very selfish to that point, when you pass away, you're going to a dimension that is very close to this earth. So we have a lot of incidences about that are reported by people. There are certain hauntings, for example. It's not all negative. If there are things that attract you to love and concern for other people, you will be in that next dimension, which is very close to this third dimension, where you're going to be looking after the person that you're concerned about or that you love. If you have an addiction, for example, Elsie Sechrist, who wrote the book Dreams, Your Magic Mirror, said that she could never pass a bar or a tavern because she could see the spirits hovering around that place. These are her people who had been alcoholics in life, and they're still addicted to alcoholism, and they're hanging around there hoping just to pick up the vibrations of alcohol. And if a person is falling down drunk in there, they could actually come in. What happens, they open that mind, and they can come in and possess the body. And that's why so many people who are really serious drinkers seem to change their personality when they're drinking. It's not necessarily them. They've opened themselves up to somebody who's addicted and still hanging around the earth. Now, there are other reasons why from that dimension, that people are still, we call earthbound. They're still focused on this three-dimensional world. I had a personal experience that of a woman, elderly lady in this case, who every time she went to bed at a certain point, something was pushing her and waking her up. She could never go to sleep. This happened for 3 or 4 days. Her daughter, who was living with her, and her father, was seeking help, and there was no medical help. Their solution was to give you a drug. But the interesting thing is the medication didn't work. She had gone 3-4 days and had never been able to sleep, because every time she started to fall asleep, something would jar her. So the desperation, the daughter called the Edgar Casey organization and said, "What's going on?" So we went there to the house. I don't see spirits, but I can feel a presence is the way I do. So sitting in the living room and talking to the people, myself, Carl Bohannon, and a woman by the name of, what was her name? It's been a long time, Susan Johnson. And we were sitting there and talking with them and getting the details of what happened. I could sense the presence. The kitchen was off to the right, and the bedrooms were off to the left. And that's where I felt that the presence was toward the bedrooms. It turns out that the son, they had a son who was killed in an automobile accident. The son was married, and they had a little child, a daughter. The mother, after the boy died, moved out to Los Angeles. She was an aspiring actress. She wanted to get into movies. The husband was extremely concerned for the little girl. So he had come to the grandmother and the aunt, look into this. So the solution was, when the grandmother and the aunt agreed to share with the child their life, bring the child to Houston, put him through school, and take care of him. And the mother was only too happy to let them do that. Once they made the agreement that they would take care of the child, there was no more incidences. It was very interesting. It only happened to the mother. The husband would sleep in bed next to her, and he never knew what was going on. Never understood it. So that was a case where love kept a soul earthbound until the solution was served. So that's the first dimension right beyond this one. We call it the earthbound solution. So loved ones, very often, many of our loved ones will hang around in that dimension because of their attraction and their feeling for somebody else that's still here. Anybody have any questions as we go along? Don't hesitate. So, let's see where we're going to go here. The only way we can describe many of those, as I mentioned before, is in terms which we understand here. The next thing is that if you have had a strong impulse in this life, like you were a builder. The example I want to use to give you an example of that is that there were two of them. There was a lady that I know that was a wonderful cook, but as she got older and older, she was increasingly unable to cook. So in following her into that next dimension higher up, she was in a place where she was preparing these fabulous meals. But in that dimension, once you get above the earthbound dimension, you no longer have to eat. So she would prepare these meals, but there was no one to eat them, and she didn't eat them. I have a personal friend whose father was a builder. He was an architect. He worked for several big architectural firms, but he loved to put things together. He built his own airplane. He did all kind of things like that. But in the last 10 years of life, he had muscular dystrophy, I guess it was. He couldn't lift his arms further than here. He couldn't even feed himself. So it must have been tremendously frustrating that he could no longer, do things for himself. So he was in a dimension. My friend had a very vivid dream that he saw his father, and his father was building a house. So he went up to his father and said, "Dad, it's really good to see you." And he says, "It's good to see you, but now I've got to finish building." He was all intent on making up for the time that he wasn't able to use his hands. So if you have a strong impulse like that, you will go to a dimension where you can relieve. But what's happening as you go along from earthbound on higher up, your personality begins to fall into the background. You're moving more and more into the light, more and more into the speed of light. And in that place, above this material life, even for the earthbound and on up, there is no sunshine because you're in the light, unless you've completely closed down your mind, which is really hard for people to do. to just come to a standstill. So there is no light, there's no need for food as we know it. There is energy, which we interpret as food, but we're not eating. We're not sitting down at the table and eat. So as you move up and higher into the vibrations of your own high mind, the personality that you're expressing right now begins to fade. For example, you will have memories of significant events to the high mind, to the soul in this life, but the other things fall away. For example, think back to when you were 6 years old. How much can you remember moment for moment the whole year that you were 6 years old? But there might have been one significant event or several significant, and you will remember those significant events, but you don't remember more and more. You had expression of a personality when you were 6, but as time goes on, you're moving away from that. So as I pass on, I will die. My memories will begin to fade, but the significant parts of those memories will stay with me until I assume another personality. Okay. Scriptures tell us about the heavens now. And most people who have been Christian in their life or are Christian have never realized what they're reading in the Old Testament. And now this was what Jesus was born and raised in. And 2,000 years ago, he was talking a language that everybody would understand. So basically, the Old Testament does describe the 7 dimensions. The first they call the veil, Vilon. You find that in Isaiah. Next you have the firmament, Rakiah in Hebrew. You find that in Genesis. You find that. The next one be the cloud, the sky, Shehakim. You find that in the Psalms. Then you have the mansions, Zebul, it's in Hebrew. And that is the golden city. You find that in 1 Kings. You find the dwelling, Mayon, and that's the place where peace and angels reign. So we're moving up in the dimensions, up into the place where peace and angels reign. Then you have the city of God, Makom, and that's a place that contains everything that is in consciousness. And that too can be found in 1 Kings. Then you have what's called the plains of God. That's the 7th and the highest, Aravat. And that's the highest heaven. That's infinity, void, emptiness, the silence. And you find that in Psalm 68. We don't have to die in order to move into the dimensions. If we become spiritual aware and we meditate, and we will begin to move into that, what we call the higher mind. And as you move more and more into your own higher mind, you become aware of those vibrations, which we call dimensions. When you reach the highest mind possible, then you are the enlightened one. You have opened your mind fully. Your mind, not somebody else's. Fully. And that is the mind that is just right there next to the creative force. That's what we call, in scientific terms, the superego. In spiritual terms, we call it the superconsciousness. So we can make the effort to get there. In India, Siddhartha Gautama, who tried all of the spiritual and religious disciplines that the religion told him, and he was getting nowhere. He'd done as much as he could. So he said, I'm going to go sit under the bo tree, and I'm going to stay there by myself in silence, prayer and meditation, until I get it. And when he got it, he called it enlightenment. When you open your mind like that, it's enlightenment. There's a good reason why in the cartoons, and a little cartoon character has an idea and you see a light bulb go up. Okay? He's in the light, but he's in his own higher mind. And we call that the Buddha, enlightenment. Jesus had the period between 12 and 30, which is called the unknown parts of his life. There is tradition, and mystics tell us, that Jesus traveled, he learned and studied with the priests and the high philosophers of Egypt, went to Persia, and then he went to India. But at one point, right before he showed up on the public scene at age 30, he was in the desert. He was in the desert praying and meditating, and that's when he opened his mind and he became the Christ. Now, what does Christ mean? It's a Greek word that means to know yourself, to be yourself, and yet one with the whole. And that's what we call enlightenment. And again, to repeat, Peter came to Jesus and said, "How can I have that mind that is in you?" Just think about it for a minute. We read that statement all our life, never thought about it. What was it telling us? It's telling us that if Peter had the mind that was in Jesus, he would be known as Peter the Christ. And if you and I have that mind that was in Jesus, we would be known as Edward the Christ, Mary the Christ, Charlotte the Christ, right on down the line. Because Christ is a state of consciousness. And that's when you fully opened up your mind to the life. What is it all about? And why are we here? We were created in the beginning to be companions and co-creators with God. So poetically, how does the scripture put it? We're walking and talking in Eden with God the Father. So that's the companionship. God is with us all the time. And he told us, I give you all of this. Here are the plants, the animals, and all of that. Name them and give them their characteristic. That's being the co-creator. So there was a point in our existence where we knew that we were companions with God and we were out there co-creating. And that's what our destiny is. That's where we're going with all of this. To open up to the fullest potential of our own mind. And how do you do that? Spend a little time every day in the silence. It doesn't matter how long. It's just what you're able to do and how long you can do it. 15, 20 minutes, get into a quiet place and sit there quietly. Have a prayer of life. Begin to see God in everything. So be grateful for everything we have and bless everything we see. That's how we begin to get into the higher mind. So I hope maybe we can have some understanding of the dimensions. You don't have to die to go into those dimensions. It just takes a little practice. But first of all, you need to understand that there are such things and what is the experience as you go through the various dimensions. That's my talk. Does anybody have any questions? Please.
Can you share more about the Kundalini meditation?
I'm sorry.
Can you share more of the Kundalini meditation you were talking about earlier?
That's a whole workshop.
Okay.
That's really a whole workshop by itself. The preparation is, to me, it's preparing your mind and understanding that you're going to depths within yourself. Within seems to seem inside and closed and maybe even down. To me, within is opening up. So it's the preparations. There are certain head and neck exercises. There are breathing exercises, deep breathing exercises. So it takes about 15 minutes at least for the preparation. And then you go into the silence. There's a chant that you can do, like humming, or you had bowls here yesterday. Begin to hum along with the bowls. What you're doing is you're aligning the vibrations of your body. Then you go into the meditation.
We'll look forward to the workshop.
We need to have a workshop.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's quite an experience. People have a lot of experiences kind of like going into the meditation. It's, very practical. But after you've done it a couple of times, you begin to go beyond the meditation. And that's when it really gets interesting. Anybody else?
You had mentioned the significance of not facing west. Why not west?
Symbolically for us, and it's kind of really unconsciously in our minds, it's dealt with negative and death. The setting sun, they're unconscious correlations in our mind, the way we've been raised in this dimension. This is strictly third dimension because when you get beyond this dimension, there are no directions because there's no sun. You're not on a revolving planet. But it's generally associated with negativity and death. So over a period of time, many of people who've been involved in prayer and meditation have said north, south, and east, but not west.
Do you have a website with recordings or certain?
No, I'm really computer ignorant myself. No, I don't. Well, thank you all. It's good to see you again, and wish you a happy fall and a happy Thanksgiving. Of course, I'll be back in Christmas, so I'll wish you a happy Christmas in December. Maybe. Keep my fingers crossed. I'll be back in December, right?
Yes, definitely.
Well, thank you all very much for coming this morning, and if you'll join us in our service.
And if you need your open. This is absolutely awesome. Whoa.
Yes, there is peace on earth, and yes, it begins with me. Yes, there is peace on earth, the peace that was meant to be. With God as creator, family all are we. Let me walk with my family in perfect harmony. Yes, there is peace on me, and this is the moment now. With every step I take, let this be my joyous vow. To take each moment and live each moment in peace eternally. Yes, there is peace on earth, and yes, it begins with me. The light of God surrounds us, the love of God enfolds us, the power of God protects us, and the presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is, and all is well. Amen.
Oh, God, see you again.
Yeah, I was like in chore land. I was working hard.